Thank you all for coming out. It's a great day, obviously, here at the National Cowboy Museum, and especially because we get to talk about cowboy history, which, of course, is our true heart and soul, is cowboy history. So the exhibition that Gretchen mentioned will open tomorrow, and I hope you all will come out for the festivities and see the exhibition. But what I'm going to show you today, along with the history of the Western Trail, are some of the artifacts and images that are included in the exhibition. So a couple of things in terms of full disclosure. In addition to my duties here at the National Cowboy Museum as Curator of Cowboy Collections and Western Art, I'm also the President of the Western Cattle Trail Association. I'm also the Vice President of the Chisholm Trail Association. So needless to say, this kind of stuff is near and dear to me. I'm also on the board of the Santa Fe Trail Association. I think it's one of those cases where if you're out of the room, you get elected to stuff. And that's really how these things occur. In terms of the Western Trail, I will remind you that on November 1st and 2nd in Dodge City, Kansas. How many of you have ever been to Dodge? That's good. Okay, good. Well, I recommend you go to Dodge again November 1st and 2nd because the Western Cattle Trail Association, in partnership with the International Chisholm Trail Association, will be holding a symposium on the Western Trail. And you'll hear all kinds of different speakers talking about different aspects of the trail. And plus you get to go to Dodge City, and that's pretty cool, right? Those of you who know anything about the history of this institution, you know that Dodge City was one of the three finalists to be the home site for the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in 1955. And there are still people in Dodge who are a little sore about that it's here in Oklahoma City. Just fair warning, fair warning. But the opportunity to celebrate a sesquicentennial, you only really get one crack at 150th birthday, so you ought to celebrate those things. And as you know, we've done that in the last couple of years with our exhibition Viva Mexico on the bicentennial of independence, Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821, which we've done, and also honoring World War I in 2018 with our Cowboys in Khaki exhibition. So the Western Trail is very much in keeping with that tradition. And I want to walk you through the trail, and that's how we set up the exhibition, because it's a little bit of a challenge to do an exhibit on a piece of geography. So what we did was we created a walk up the Western Trail. Now, as you can see from the map, it's a long ways. It's about 2,300 miles from South Texas up to Western Canada, and that's an important thing to remember is how long it is. So I'd also encourage you to go down to our Atherton galleries because we reinstalled the parts that were used for Prix de West. I hope you'll go down and see our new installation on the Cowboy Artists of America. There's some old friends that are back out, as well as some new friends that we brought out of the vault. And we've also reinstalled what we used to call our Illustrators Gallery. We now call our Storytellers Gallery. And also a section that we used to do the Broadkin exhibits in is now our new Storytellers section. And we've, of course, restored the Tom Lovell Studio, where we can teach and learn about how art is made. So I encourage you to go down and take a look at those. We also brought some artifacts out, particularly Bill Owen's saddle, that was very much part of the CA's empty saddle. So as I mentioned, in terms of doing an exhibition about a geographical series of events, it's important to remember where the Western Trail went. And if you know anything about recent research on the Comanche Nation, you've heard me recommend before Pekka Hämäläinen's Comanche Empire, and this is actually a map from his book right here that showed that the Comanches basically ruled everything in the center part of the United States from the Front Range of the Rockies to the Mississippi Valley. And the Western Trail cuts right through that. Now, adjacent to it, of course, is a map of Indian Territory showing from 1867 to 1889. And right here is the Comanche Kiowa Apache Reservation right here. And there's Old Greer County, formerly a part of Texas and now part of Oklahoma. So the Western Trail cuts right through there. And that's an important thing to understand is where does it go and where can we see it today. The other part of this equation is the presence of the federal government primarily, and I can only show you this map, but there was a ring of forts, as you can see here, and they extended up into Western Indian Territory, up into Western Kansas, and it was a semicircle of forts that ultimately helped protect the Western Trail, which is right here. The Chisholm Trail system is here, and just for point of reference, the Chisholm Trail did not really exist during the trail driving period. It was called by different names only in recent popular culture has it become known as the Chisholm Trail. And the Chisholm Trail, truly the trade trail associated with Jesse Chisholm is roughly from about Purcell to Enid. That's really the only part that's really the true Chisholm Trail. The rest of it, in Texas it was called the Abilene Trail, and in Kansas it was called the Texas Trail. Likewise, the Western Trail was known by various names, but the Western being the most common. But the frontier federal forts that were put out, as you can see from this map, I think largely were put there, at least in some respects, to protect the cattle industry, the nascent cattle industry that was just beginning. However, a couple of events occur, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that in the new Cheyenne Ledger Art exhibition that you'll learn more about through the brown bag next week from Dr. Singleton, also opens in a gallery adjacent to where the Western Trail is. And there are references to the Red River War. At my old job where I worked for 31 years at Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, that was the Red River War artifact site. And that museum also owned the Adobe Wall site as well as the Buffalo Wallow site, battle sites. And so I did a lot of work on the Red River War before I came here to the National Cowboy Museum. So this story, as you can see, was precipitated in August of 1874 after the first cattle drive that went up the Western Trail in March, which we'll learn about in just a minute. But you can see the Red River War was primarily a roundup operation to push those who had left the reservations here in southwestern Oklahoma back onto the reservations here. But once that's over, when Quanah surrenders at Fort Sill in May of 1875, the Western Trail is wide open. And it's this man, John Lytle, who is credited with blazing the Western Trail from down at Medina, Texas, which is southwest of San Antonio, all the way up to Fort Robinson, Nebraska. How many of you have ever been to Fort Robinson, Nebraska? I strongly encourage you to go up and see it because it's pretty spectacular. It was originally established as the Red Cloud Agency. Eventually, a federal fort was built adjacent to it. Red Cloud Agency eventually moved. But this is where Crazy Horse was captured and imprisoned and ultimately murdered while he was incarcerated. So it's an important American site. If you love American history, go to Fort Robinson. You can also stay there. There are campgrounds, RV sites. The state of Nebraska has done a great job in maximizing that former federal asset. But adjacent to the fort was the Red Cloud Agency here. And John T. Lytle basically took advantage of the call for beef cattle to feed these native people on these reservations in the western part of the United States and drove a herd of about 3,500 beef steers from Medina County, Texas, up to Fort Robinson, Nebraska. And it's up in the panhandle of almost in South Dakota, what's now South Dakota today. And the landscape, that's worth seeing anyway because you're only about 30 miles from the Black Hills. It truly is the southern part of the Black Hills that's not part of the national park. So it's a spectacular place to go. And as I said, you can stay there. But in any case, this is what starts the Western Trail. A couple of reasons. And we'll look at the map here really quickly. And I cut off part of the image. But you can see the Western starts in northern Mexico. There are feeder routes that go into the main trunk line that goes all the way north. And then there are what are called splinter routes, where routes would cut off at certain places to satisfy different markets. But the thing to remember is that it initially went through western Kansas, and the quarantines against Texas cattle in Kansas eventually shut it down in 1885. And this map actually comes from the primary text written by the true Western Trail historians Gary and Margaret Kreisinger, whose book, The Western Trail, Its Rise, Collapse, and Resurrection, won a Wrangler Award here in 2016. That book is out of print, but we do still have some copies in the museum store, and if you don't have one of those for your library, I encourage you to do that. So the collapse was brought on by the state of Kansas closing the entire state to Texas cattle on the hoof in 1885, so the Western Trail had to swing west over just along the Kansas-Colorado border and then headed on north up into Wyoming. So a lot of things happened in terms of its lifespan. It lasted from 1874 to 1897, as you can see, and it runs all the way from Mexico to Canada. We believe, and the estimates are the best we can do, 6 to 8 million cattle went up, and it crossed 9 different states. And that's why we know it as the greatest cattle trail of them all, because it took more cattle, It lasted longer, it covered more distance than all the other cattle trails combined. However, most of you probably never even heard of the Western Trail. Or if you had no idea where it is. There's never been a motion picture about the Western Trail. Meanwhile, there are multiple films about the Chisholm Trail or even the Shawnee-Sedalia Trail. So that's one of the things that's not in its favor, is it's not known as well in popular culture. So what were the animals they were taking up, and why the Western Trail? As I mentioned before, John Lytle blazed the trail to meet a new demand for beef cattle on reservations in the western part of the United States. But it also allowed for the establishment of ranches on the northern plains. And virtually every cow that ended up on major ranches in Wyoming, the Dakotas, Montana, northern Colorado, all came from Texas. So the bulk of the cattle that went up the Western Trail were not put on trains and shipped to processing houses in Kansas City, Chicago, St. Louis, and so on. They were what were called range cattle or finishing cattle to take them north and help establish ranches. Stocker cattle is what they were also known as. So they were stocking on ranches, cattle that looked like this. So this is one painting by this artist, Frank Ray, that we borrowed from the Gilcrease, and it'll be here for about another month, so I encourage you to go down and see it. Mr. Ray was the only artist who painted the cattle drives while they were actually happening. Virtually all the rest of the artists were painting them either from memory or fantasy, and I do give a talk about art of the cattle trail so we can look at those fantastical renditions of what New Yorkers and artists from Boston thought a cattle drive ought to look like, and they certainly didn't look like cattle like this. I wrote a book on Mr. Ray also called Rounded Up in Glory. We used to carry it in the store. I don't know if we do anymore, but it's a biography of Mr. Ray. So it's not a picture book, but you might find him interesting. He's a pretty fascinating character, very much a Renaissance man. But this is the type of cattle that were taking up the Western Trail to meet that demand. So who are the drovers? The drovers look like this young man. This is a photograph from the Dickinson Research Center. We used all the assets we could in putting together Western Trail exhibition. This is actually taken at Cheyenne, Wyoming. One of the things that drovers on the trail, and they weren't called cowboys yet, and that's an important thing to remember. They're really not called cowboys in a positive way till about 1890. Up to that point, a cowboy was someone who was associated with a criminal element or thought of as drunken and reckless and people you didn't really want around or in your town. That's another lecture for another day. But they were called drovers. This comes from the idea of a group of large animals taken to market is called a drove. And the men and usually there were men that took those animals to market were called drovers. On occasion, there might be a little boy with a stick who might take, I don't know, half dozen head to market, and he was called the cowboy. Imagine that. Imagine that. So the drovers looked like this. 75% of them were white men. Many of them were from the South, but not all of them were from the South. So they came from all over the world. 25% were either black, Hispanic, Native American, or mixed race. So a 25%, not 25% black, 25% Native American. That's not what I mean. It's a combination. As they went up the trail, they rode a saddle that looked like this. And once they were in the saddle, they stayed in the saddle all day long. The only time they dismounted was to change horses, and they would change horses 6 to 8 times a day. Because even though in the cowboy movies, John Wayne rides the same horse through the whole cattle drive, that's not how it works, because the horses get tired too. So they had their own string on a cattle drive, and they would change. They'd get down to relieve themselves, of course, and then eat dinner, which you all call lunch. And they'd also dismount for supper, which you all mistakenly called dinner. Other than that, they're in a saddle, and there's no cushioning in a saddle like this. This is a high back saddle, as you can see, that tall cantle there functions very much like a backrest. They also rode on the arch of the foot, not on the ball of the foot, which ultimately gave rise to what we know today as a cowboy boot, because they have a steel shank in the instep that allows for more comfort when you're riding in the saddle. They're not dismounting like cowboys do today all the time to open the gate or getting something they forgot at the pickup or to get their cell phone or whatever it is they do. Once they're mounted, they stayed mounted. They get up about 4 a.m. and they're in the saddle until they can't see. So they rode from can see to can't, typically. So this young man at the end of the trail, you'll notice he's wearing a new suit of clothes, and this is the one way I can really help you understand what it was like. As romantic as popular culture has made it sound, from day one when you start on this 2,300-mile journey, your clothes are wet, and they never dry out because you sweat through them multiple times a day. It will rain on you, it will hail on you, it will snow on you, and you're always crossing rivers. Remember, the western United States is a ladder of rivers all the way to Canada, and you're constantly getting wet. So imagine that. You're wearing the same clothes for 4 months, and they're wet. So when you get to wherever it is you're going, whether that's Cheyenne or Miles City or wherever you're going, the first thing you're going to do is get new clothes. And you're going to get clean. You're going to get shaved because these cowboys are not getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning and shaving clean like you see in the cowboy movies. Nobody does that unless you want a blood transfusion. And there's no urgent care center to help you with your tummy ache or your hangnail on a cattle drive. So that's important to remember. So they rode tough saddles and they were tough men. And most of them were just kids, the average age 15 to 25 years old. During the trail driving period that ended with the end of the Western Trail, about 35,000 men went up the trail. Some women occasionally, but most of them were men and they looked like this. Yeah, combined. That's what they estimate, the best estimate is. And all these drovers moved on their stomach. Lynn Shackelford's here, who helps us every year with our great Chuck Wagon Festival, the best of its kind. And he can tell you that nobody does good work unless they're well fed. Now, I'm not saying the food's good, not necessarily, but there's a lot of it. That's the thing. Cowboys ate hot and lots. That's my justification for any meal. As long as it's hot and as long as there's lots of it, I'm good. Full of carbohydrates, right, for energy, and also protein. Most of the time they're eating beef. I'm not going to get into a chuck wagon cooking because we don't have time. This is a great photograph in our Dickinson Research Center showing a chuck wagon outfit. Everything's spread out. The boys are eating on the ground. It's one of our best photographs in my opinion, and it's up in Dakota Territory. We're not sure where, but this is on the Chisholm or the Western Trail system. Everything started in and around San Antonio in terms of what they called shaping up the herds. They would be gathered in northern Mexico, mostly wild cattle, South Texas. The King Ranch plays a big role in this as well. Richard King did not call it the trail, he called it the Kansas Road. And he had what he called were his Kansas men who would negotiate the sale of his cattle once they got to one of the Kansas cow towns or further on north. The Menger Hotel in downtown San Antonio still stands. You can actually visit it, as you can visit the Buckhorn Saloon. So it was a gathering place for these animals to get shaped and trail broke. Remember, these are wild animals. Unlike in the cowboy movies, they all look pretty tame. And that's one of the things Mr. Ray said. As soon as they started breeding up these Texas Longhorns with European cattle, they got stupider and stupider. So these are animals that would, when they saw a human on the ground especially, they would run. And so journal after journal, interview after interview talks about these Texas cattle constantly trying to turn back south to go home. That's all they wanted to do was go home. But eventually got them shaped up and they understood what their role was. There was usually a lead steer or a lead cow, sometimes a lead cow. Charles Goodnight's first lead animal was actually a cow called Maud, for example. But this is really where they kind of gathered everything together, was south of San Antonio, and then they swung west. However, because San Antonio was a gathering place in 1915, the Old Time Trail Drivers Association was founded there, and immediately they started gathering oral histories. This is why oral history is so important, and it has to be complete. However, even though these interviews were compiled into a book by J. Marvin Hunter called The Trail Drivers of Texas, we have to remember that memories are often faulty. And this is where confusion about certain trails got mixed up in some of these. Remember, these are old men. This is 50 years after they had gone up the trail. And oftentimes, their times they went up the trail got exaggerated. So you probably have someone in your family who went up the Chisholm or went up the Western or went up the Shawnee. Great-great-grandpa went up about 10 or 12 times. Well, I'm here to tell you great-grandpa's probably a liar. Because it was so hard, most of them did it once. And many of them quit halfway, said, I'm not doing this anymore. This is way too hard. And it's certainly not like the Hollywood movies make it sound. It was so hard. It was dirty, with all due respect to Lynn here. The food wasn't great. And the pay was $1 a day after 1880. From 1880 to 1930, the average cowboy wage was $1 a day. A cook made $50 to $75, so you got paid a lot more. There we go. And there we go. And the wagon boss, or the lead man got paid $75. So that's pretty good wages. But in any case, these interviews are really what we base most of our cowboy history on, our drover history, is men like this in this panoramic photograph we have in the DRC. After it swung west and northwest around San Antonio, it came near the Clear Fork of the Brazos where Fort Griffin was built. And unfortunately, what happened when you have a fort town or a fort built on a hill, this is Fort Griffin here, a less than high-quality town was usually built nearby. And it had all kinds of entertainments associated with it, to the point where, and this is actually a photograph of a reconstruction of one of the buildings that was on what was called the Flats. Eventually it became so crime-ridden the fort had to take over jurisdiction and run all the riffraff out. But this was also a resupply depot to the point where it eventually eclipsed Fort Worth as the supply depot for herds going up the trail. By 1880, European cattle have already been brought into the ranges across the west, on the southern plains to be sure. And to protect that investment from the diseases that were carried, primarily what was called Texas fever, carried by Texas cattle, even though they really weren't sure why. They just knew if Texas longhorns mingled with domesticated herds, the domestic animals would usually die. That's why there were quarantines all the way through the Midwest, all the way to the end of the western end of the state of Kansas by 1885. That fear of infection eventually resulted in 1881 the institution of what became known as the Winchester Quarantine, led by none other than Charles Goodnight, who was one of the first inductees into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in 1955. This is an original letter we have in the Dickinson Research Center, and there's its transcription. And the best line, of course, "You will never pass through here in good health." One of the few times cowboys or drovers were armed, and they were all armed with rifles and carbines. And they ultimately created a highway through which herds out of South Texas could pass and avoid the already established ranches in the western part of the southern plains and go around them and head north. Eventually what happened was you have cutoffs or splinter trails like right here. This is what I'm talking about. The Potter Bacon cutoff. They met the Winchester Quarantine. Jack Potter, who was a drover there, met the Winchester Quarantine and then cut off across the Texas Panhandle and up into Colorado and further on north eventually. So there were splinter routes all along the way. One of the most famous or infamous towns along that splinter route was Tascosa, Texas, which had very much an unsavory reputation. This is the famous Equity Bar here on the left with a pull-out awning. They were very sophisticated, as you can see. And this is a famous photograph by Irwin Smith, done about 1906, where he's posed a bunch of cowboys along a bar. But if you look really closely, they're all drinking coffee. Wait a minute. What's that about? So keep that in mind about mythology as we go along. Through the western part of Oklahoma, this is a map also in the DRC. You can see the Western Trail here as it goes through western Oklahoma counties. And it swung west, roughly around Woodward to the west, and certainly around what was then known as Camp Supply, eventually Fort Supply. Because of the military reservation was so big, they weren't allowed to drive cattle through it, but they could resupply at Camp Supply as they went along. They used the sutler store there. And as they got closer to the Red River, they came to one of the last places where these drovers could mail a letter or to be resupplied, and it was at Doan's Crossing. How many of you have ever been to Doan's Crossing? Doan's Crossing. Go to Altus, go south 18 miles, go east about 6 miles, and you'll be right there. In the late 1920s, a former drover named Peter Ackley decided to take it upon himself to mark what he called the Western Texas Chisholm Trail. Well, the Chisholm Trail crossing is about 100 miles east of here. So he got his, as I said before, faulty memories, and he actually ultimately supported the building of a monument the Old Trail Drivers Association of Texas found out what he had done and said, that's a bunch of nonsense. This isn't where that trail went. It actually went 100 miles east of here. So if you look right here on the monument, there's a strip right there. They actually chiseled the incorrect information off. They also hired an artist, none other than H.D. Bugbee, to make a painting that was turned into a bronze bas-relief. The slide you really can't see very well, but we do have the actual painting in the exhibition down the hall that was used as the model. And multiple cattle brands from West Texas, Western Oklahoma, and so on are carved into the back. It's really worth seeing. And the remains of the Doan store are still there. And it was an adobe site used by the traders, the Doan brothers. Camp Supply in Indian Territory, as I mentioned before, they had to go around it to the west. Native people understood that these cattle herds were going through, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. But they circled around to the west but would resupply here. This is actually a wood engraving that appeared in Scribner's magazine to show what Camp Supply looked like in northwestern Indian Territory. Anybody ever been there? Good. They've now shut it down. You can't go see the historic buildings, sadly. It's a great historic site that really ought to be supported by the state of Oklahoma. I'm just going to say that out loud. However, during the life of the Western Trail, a group of northern Cheyennes were displaced from their homelands up in Wyoming and western Nebraska and then brought down to be housed at Fort Reno and the Darlington Agency in northwestern Oklahoma. However, remember, these are cousins related to the Southern Cheyennes, but they're not, families have squabbles. I'm going to make this a gross oversimplification. The Northern Cheyennes and Southern Cheyennes had a split. That occasionally happens. However, Cheyennes are Cheyennes, right? So we ought to put them all together down in northwestern Oklahoma, according to the U.S. federal government. And they did. Meanwhile, the Northern Cheyennes are saying, well, this isn't our country. This isn't where we belong. We want to go home. And eventually they broke out and left and followed the Western Trail all the way back to their traditional homelands, pursued by the U.S. Army, who couldn't find them. Eventually, as they started their trip, they killed 2 drovers on the Western Trail and took their horses. I'm not saying this is an indictment. They needed horses. They needed transportation. And it eventually became written up in a book. We'll get to the book in a minute. And they exited Kansas, in northwestern Kansas, at a place called Oberlin, where there were settlers who were involved in the conflict. And there's a cemetery and a monument. The last Indian fight monument is here at Oberlin. But if you'll notice right here, that's a Western Trail marker right there. Maury Sandoz eventually wrote a book called Cheyenne Autumn, turned into a major film in the early 1970s, starring none other than Sal Mineo as a Cheyenne. And of course, we talk about white actors playing Native people in our Western Performers Gallery. So go down and take it. It was a major motion picture, actually directed by John Ford. How many of you ever seen Cheyenne Autumn? It's quite a film. So that's part of the Western Trail story as well. Eventually, the Western Trail heads northwest and doesn't go into Dodge necessarily. A portion of those cattle went into Dodge and were loaded on the Santa Fe Railway to go back east to the processing houses. But most of the cattle on the Western Trail swung west around town. However, Dodge City, of course, became known as the cowboy capital, and every other town in the West becomes the cowboy capital ultimately. How do we talk about the town of Dodge City? We have photographs in the collection, but we also have a costume worn by none other than James Arness, who starred as Matt Dillon in Gunsmoke, and this is one of his costumes from, there are 3 Gunsmoke movies made after the series was canceled. He was also 6'7", if most of you didn't know that. So we had to find the tallest exhibit case we have to accommodate his costume. We couldn't even put the hat on top because he's too tall. So do make sure you come in and see that. That's part of our collection. And also, if you know anything about Lonesome Dove, even though they never mention it in the novel nor in the film, it actually follows the Western Trail. Now, what I'm not saying is the Western Trail is the Lonesome Dove Trail. Please don't ever say that. This is a work of fiction. Fiction. This is actually the studio's map. I was able to obtain a copy of that from Bill Whitliff, who was one of the producers back in my days of youthful exuberance. And there are certain sites along the way during the story where the trail herd visits, but eventually they end up in northern Montana. So they follow the Western Trail. So how do we accommodate that in our exhibition? Is this going to work? We actually finally have a Lonesome Dove artifact in our collection, and it's from this scene right here.
Let's go.
Go. I thought as long as we're in town, we'd have us a meal and talk some philosophy.
I don't know of philosophy. Now let's go. I don't like being away from the herds. Most of these boys in town.
I'll take it.
This is Dixon, our scout. We're looking for fresh horses. Ours are putting their war out, chasing Red Cloud. That's a nice-looking animal you got right there.
Well, thank you. I like him myself.
I'll take him and any others you got.
He's not for sale.
I ain't asking. I'm telling you. I'm requisitioning that horse for the government.
I'm telling you, he's not for sale.
Now, ain't you a tomcat? I'll teach you to sass me, cowboy.
Go on, get his horse.
No, sir, this horse ain't for sale. This just told you that.
You cowboys are pests. Even your pups. Now give me that horse.
No, sir.
I said give me that horse.
No, sir.
Damn you.
No, sir.
Damn. Give me that horse.
No, sir.
Give it to me.
This horse ain't for sale.
Give me that horse. Let him go. Give me that horse. Give it to me. I said give it to me. Give me that horse. Damn you. Give me that horse.
Leave him alone. What's he know? He's killing him, Gus.
Timmy, you get back to the wagon, son.
Stay back here, Junior. Stay back here.
Woodrow! Me! Woodrow, it's me! It's me, Augustus! Damn it, Woodrow! Look at me now! Woodrow! All right, now.
Where?
You hurt?
No, sir. He just quirted me a little bit. Newt wouldn't let him take Dish's horse. Much obliged to you for that, Newt. It's all right, Dish.
Come in and go right now.
There ain't much left to go with.
Just get what there is, Sergeant.
You bring the wagon?
I'll bring it.
I hate rude behavior in a man. Won't tolerate it.
So we now own that prop court given to us by Paul Moore, sculptor, and we tested it for Ricky Schroeder's DNA, so it's really on there. That's a joke. Throughout the exhibition, we have a couple of film clips that were related to particular sites on the trail, so you can access using your QR code. Now, I tried that on my flip phone. It doesn't work because I bang it on the wall and it doesn't really work. But if you got one of those smartphone deals, you can scan the QR code and watch the clip, including that one, as well as one from the TV show Laramie, when you get to Laramie as you're walking up the trail. This is a photograph from the Nebraska Historical Society showing the issuing of beef at Fort Robinson, a Red Cloud agency. And it was because of these beef cattle brought up the trail, the Western Trail, by John Lytle and subsequent contractors, that these native people received what were called their rations, or their monthly allotment. You can look up the amount of beef each family was issued and so on. But it was highly regulated and highly corrupt, frankly, by the federal agencies. But this is a really important photograph for y'all to see. We have a detail of it in the exhibition. John Lytle, like most of the men that were taking trail crews up the Western Trail, was a contractor. In other words, he didn't he didn't take his own cattle. He hired himself out, and his crew, like you hire a roofer to roof your house, you'd hire a droving contractor to take your cattle north for you for X number of dollars per head. So let's say it's $1 a head. And you had to trust that contractor to bring your selling price and the money that came with it back to you wherever you were. And so it was a risky business, but ultimately it's all part of that supply and demand story. As the trail went north, there were splinter routes. So one headed out, so Ogallala, of course, is a little farther east than Fort Robinson. There was a splinter route that headed after you crossed the Platte River. You went straight west towards Cheyenne, and ultimately it gave rise to that cattle industry there. You know about the Cheyenne Social Club and the establishment of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, another story for another day, but ultimately led to the establishment of what's called the daddy of them all, the Cheyenne Frontier Days Rodeo. Laramie also became a spot heading further north, sort of east-central Wyoming. It was also where you crossed the river and headed toward the Powder River country. And John Smith, who we just inducted into the National Performers Hall of Fame, starred in a television series called Laramie. And you can actually watch the Trail Drive episode in the exhibition if you use the QR code. Now, you'll be surprised that all the cattle are running in this scene, and apparently that's how they did it in the cowboy movies back in the day. Well, you certainly didn't. If you ran your cattle, they lost weight and you lost money. So they walked, averaging about 10 miles a day would be a good day. 15 miles would be an excellent day. So a chuck wagon cook, their job was to feed the cowboys, and of course they put out a full spread, didn't they, Lynn? Every morning with pancakes and waffles, and scrambled eggs and bacon, sausage if you wanted it and everything. Wrong. Typically a breakfast would be, let's say, a biscuit left over from the night before and a big hunk of lard and a big cup of coffee. Does that sound good? Yeah, you bet. So you had to drink some cowboy soup before you got in the saddle. But the biggest meal of the day was, of course, dinner. And that chuck wagon cook's job was to feed them, pack up, move to about halfway where they were going for the day, set it all up again, cook a great big meal. Sometimes they'd have a siesta, let the cattle rest. Then he'd pack it all up and do it again for supper. Hardest job on the trail drive in many respects was the chuck wagon cook, and not really covered as well as they really should. Sheridan, Wyoming, and north central, a little east of central in Wyoming, eventually has its own rodeo, as does Laramie. And it's all an offshoot of that cattle industry that went through Sheridan. We're lucky here at the National Cowboy Museum in that we have artifacts related directly to the Western Trail with the acquisition just a couple of years ago of this Colt Single Action Army revolver, carried from South Texas by John B. Kendrick, who was a drover on the Western Trail, eventually stayed and bought into ranches in north central Wyoming as well as southeastern Montana on Hanging Woman Creek, and this revolver is now part of our collection. Eventually he became a U.S. Senator, a state senator, and then governor of Wyoming, and built a grand home, as you can see there in Sheridan. You can now visit as a Wyoming historic site, so I encourage you to do that. He was also inducted into the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in 1958. Now, this is one of the great names along the route, of course, is Belle Fourche. Who can tell me the reference to Belle Fourche from popular culture? Thank you very much. Yes. I had to put this in here just so we can say Belle Fourche, right? And while the Cowboys movie isn't technically on the Western Trail, is actually on a splinter route from southwestern Montana over to Belle Fourche, which was the end of the rail line according to the fictional story of the Cowboys. Eventually, it established its own rodeo and its own cattle industry there in Belle Fourche, which is in just north of the Black Hills in South Dakota. But we do, in fact, own artifacts from that production, including John Wayne's hat that he wore in the Cowboys and 4 other films, as did Sam Elliott in one of the Sackett movies too. So that's on exhibit in the exhibition. Deadwood is not very far away, and even though Deadwood was never truly a cow town, it was supplied by the Western Trail, and we in fact have a costume worn by Ian McShane, and as a role as one of the unsavory characters in Deadwood. I never watched this particular HBO production, but we do have that costume to help remind that people are still eating beef, even if they're not technically on the cattle trail. Dickinson, North Dakota, in southwestern North Dakota was very much on the Western Trail as it swung west of town, and they operated a stage line that often carried drovers and cattlemen to other parts. Fort Buford in northern North Dakota was also one of the extents of the splinter route that headed off to the northeast, and it was supplied by steamboat along the Missouri River. At Miles City, Montana, of course, when you cut off northwest across the Powder River and headed towards Miles City, it's often thought of as the end of the line for the Western Trail. I love this quotation from this photograph, which is a series of stereographs put out for public school teachers that beef and freedom go together. Well, hell yeah, there we go. Did I say that out loud? Sorry, Mama, forgive me. But the Miles City Roundup, of course, is now a prominent rodeo, and I think it's a working ranch cowboy rodeo as well, so we put that in the exhibition. I chose images from our vast rodeo photography collection where most of these cowboys are riding steers because, of course, long before there was PBR, they were riding steers before they were riding bulls. So let's keep it in historical perspective. Fort Benton up in northern Montana was the last place for resupply on the Missouri River, and then it also supplied the cattle industry farther north up into western Canada. And that's where we end our tale, is at Fort MacLeod, which was built specifically to protect the newly established cow town of Fort MacLeod from cattle rustling, from thievery, from whiskey smugglers who came onto the reservations or reserves, as they call them up there. And we actually have a Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniform in the exhibition. And, of course, a reminder for popular culture that Gary Cooper was a member of the Northwest Mounted Police at one time during his career. We just recently acquired an official saddle that was ridden by the Northwest Mounted Police. This is a recent gift from a woman from East Texas. These are extremely rare, and as you can see, it doesn't look too much like a military saddle. That's clearly based on Western stock saddles that came up the Western Trail. Ignore the rope, that's just in there for the photograph, but we actually sell this reproduction in Persimmon Hill, showing whiskey smugglers caught with the goods. That was in the collection here for a while, but he's wearing that Royal Canadian Mounted Police uniform. So it goes all the way from northern Mexico all the way up to western Canada. And I'll conclude this way. Since 1967, there are those who have supported designating the Chisholm Trail system as a National Historic Trail. Since about 2016, the National Park Service submitted its own findings to establish both the Chisholm Trail system and the Western Trail system as National Historic Trails. It failed again. Now, here's what I'll tell you, is these beef trails built America. Because this great country, as you may have heard me say before, was built on beef and bread and not on broccoli. Because all the things that occurred, the great successes in this country, are built on how well you're fed. Pekka Hemalainen talks about this in talking about the Comanche Nation. The better fed they were, the more powerful they became. And ultimately, these beef cattle trails, particularly these two, helped create the nation and helped drive the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Now, in recent times, because as I said, I'm associated with those two cattle trail associations, we've included the Shawnee system that goes up this way, the Goodnight Loving system that circles around Comancheria and heads up this way. We're trying to establish a cattle trails consortium so we can finally get the attention of the U.S. Congress that just as much as the Santa Fe, the Oregon, the California, the immigrant trails have already been long established as National Historic Trails, these deserve it too. And hopefully the efforts here at the National Cowboy Museum will play a role in that by bringing attention on this sesquicentennial. So thank you.